That's what I did.
Yeah.
I can have a bunchy, can you come bunchy?
Great, well ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming tonight. It's an absolute pleasure. After today's wombling efforts, many of us were out collecting litter from the side, to be here tonight to celebrate the 396th birthday of John Aubrey. And that's actually tomorrow, but it's quite an impressive feat. So 2027, I think we're going to have a really big party and a cake. I think we should. Anyway, we're really lucky to have Tony McAlevey with us. Tony has written various books of a historical nature and is based in Malmesbury and probably knows more about, well, Thomas Hobbes and John Aubrey than anybody else. So it's absolutely brilliant to have him here. And enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. So this talk was supposed to happen exactly 3 years ago, but some event or other got in the way. So it's great finally to be here and great to be able to share some of my findings about John Aubrey. And I've written these up in a book that was published last year, and I explained a little bit about the focus of the book. But Aubrey provides the sort of the spine of the story about the way in which certain members of the elite, certain intellectuals, thought about the supernatural and witchcraft in the 17th century. And for what for me was a surprising discovery, that a group of leading intellectuals, not just Aubrey, but people like Robert Boyle, the chemist, set out to reconcile commitment to modern science with belief in the authenticity of witchcraft. And in the process, they influenced people in the wider world, and I think thereby sustained the persecution of women for witchcraft. And they were particularly influential in New England and made a contribution to the events in Salem in 1692. So that's been the focus for my research. It's quite a dark topic, and it sheds not a particularly flattering light on our man, John Aubrey. So I'm sorry, but I'm going to say some negative things about this son of Wiltshire. The guy who went to school in Yatton, and there we are. I've just followed the sources. At the same time, I'm acutely aware of what a brilliant, literally brilliant individual Aubrey was. So I call my talk North Wiltshire's wayward genius, because he was a genius, and I'll say a little bit about his genius. But there is a dark side to Aubrey, which I'd like to talk about as well, if I may. So he was born at Easton Piercy, just outside Kington St Michael, and his house is no longer there, but it's somewhere near this farm, Easton Piercy Farm. He drew his house and his fabulous garden in 1669, which was a very significant year in his life, of which more in a moment. There's some debate as to whether it actually looked like that, or whether that was the way he wanted it to look, in terms of this fabulous Italianate Renaissance garden around the terrace there. It's a rather lovely picture, and it's a reminder that amongst so many things, he was a real polymath. He was quite a talented artist, and the Bodleian Library manuscript that's got that picture has also got these rather, I think, evocative pictures of views at Easton Piercy through some of the Renaissance gateways. So that rather striking picture there of the avenue of cypresses. So that's where he grew up, and he went to school, surprise, surprise, in Yatton. And he went to school in the church. The church was the school, and he tells us about his education at Yatton, about how he entered into his grammar. He started to learn Latin grammar at Yatton, and he was taught by the curate, Mr. Hart, who taught the eldest boys Virgil, Ovid, and Cicero. He wasn't one of the older boys, he was one of the younger boys. He talks about how he was shocked, even at that young age, by the fact that they were told to cover their exercise books with manuscripts from Malmesbury Abbey. He didn't quite understand what was going on. He rather liked the elegancy of the writing and the coloured initial letters. And the reason that he was being invited to do this was because the rector, he was taught by the curate, the rector, William Stump, was the great-grandson of William Stump, the clothier of Malmesbury, who got hold of Malmesbury Abbey at the time of the dissolution, and got hold of the residue of the library. So the rector of Yatton Kennel had what was left of the library of Malmesbury Abbey, and they used the manuscripts, rather shockingly, to cover exercise books, and also to use when bunging up barrels of ale. So Aubrey said in his distinctive fashion of Stump, rector of Yatton Kennel, he was a proper man and a good fellow. Now, a good fellow meant he liked a drink. It's not a particularly complimentary phrase in the way he uses it. He also describes the father of Thomas Hobbes, who was a very disreputable clergyman, as a good fellow because he liked a drink. Anyway, little Aubrey was a bit shocked by this. He only spent a year or so at Yatton, and then went off to the church school at Lee Delamere, where he was taught by the vicar there, who was a rather remarkable man called Latimer, who was also many years before the teacher of Thomas Hobbes, where again they had access to these manuscripts. And Aubrey says how he went back to Yatton Kennel in 1647, when he, just after the English Civil War, when he was at Atterley's End, out of curiosity to see the manuscripts of Parson Stump. Stump was still around, but all the manuscripts had gone by then. His sons were gunners and soldiers, and they scoured their guns with them. So it's pretty shocking, really. But Stump showed me several old deeds granted by the Lord Abbots with their seals annexed, which I suppose his son, Captain Thomas Stump of Malmesbury, hath still. Now remember that name, Captain Thomas Stump of Malmesbury, his son, because he's quite an important person. I'd like to tell you a little bit about him. Okay, so Hobbes was a genius. Aubrey was also a genius, and actually this bit of Wiltshire produced these two geniuses that around the same time, which is pretty remarkable. And you'll know, what a polymath he was, what a Renaissance man he was. So I've shown you some of his artwork, so to speak. And of course, perhaps he's most famous of all for sort of inventing modern archaeology. There, his groundbreaking, accurate depiction of Stonehenge, famous for discovering Avery. I don't quite know how people hadn't noticed Avery, but he's famous for discovering Avery and surveying it with great accuracy. He is inventing archaeology, he's inventing folklore studies. He wrote a book called Remains of Gentilism, which is a study of rural folklore, rural traditions. His Natural History of Wiltshire is an amazing book, amongst other things, groundbreaking in terms of its treatment of geology and fossils. And he was a biographer, and a particularly innovative biographer in terms of these very succinct, brief lives that he wrote. That's the entirety on the right-hand side of the manuscript in the volume of his life of Shakespeare, which are written in a really entertaining, quirky way, and were based on very, very rigorous research. One of the people he wrote about, and his intention was not to do a brief life, it was to do a full-length biography, was Thomas Hobbes, his friend, much older man, but he befriended him, who came from Malmesbury, and he was very systematic in terms of his research, and his notes for his proposed, he never got around to writing his full-length biography, but his biography of Hobbes is still in the Bodleian. This is the horoscope of Hobbes. He talked to Hobbes, and this must have been quite an amusing conversation because Aubrey believed completely in astrology. He was completely committed to astrology. Hobbes thought it was complete nonsense, but he liked Aubrey and he humoured him. So he played along and said, well, of course, yes, of course, what do you want to know? Well, when exactly were you born? And Hobbes, I don't know whether he was making this up actually with a degree of precision, but he was born apparently on the 5th of April 1588, being Good Friday, at 2 minutes past 5 in the morning. That's what that says. And oh, that's great. And so he was able to get a horoscope of Hobbes. Aubrey drew the cottage where Hobbes was born in Malmesbury on the horse fair, sadly demolished in the 19th century. The only reason we have any idea as to what it looked like is because Hobbes made that sketch. And he did a sketch of Malmesbury in the area where Hobbes grew up and where he went to school. On the left-hand side there's St. Mary's Church with the spire, and to the left of it is the Three Cups, the boozer, which is still there, where Hobbes' father, almost certainly disreputable clergyman that he was, went drinking. And opposite, it's now a butcher's and a delicatessen, the place where Hobbes went to school. And we only know about these things because of Aubrey's wonderful researches. So we owe a huge debt to Aubrey. Aubrey was a brilliant man, and I just want to tell you a little story that you may or may not know about, which is in the Natural History of Literature, which relates to a man from Yatton Kennel. And actually we've met him already because he was Thomas Stump, the son of the rector of Yatton Kennel. And this is from the Natural History of Wiltshire, and he says, the elder son of William Stump, rector of Yatton Kennel, was a boy of a most daring spirit. He would climb towers and trees most dangerously. He had too much spirit to be a scholar, and about 16 went in a voyage with his uncle, since Sir Thomas Ivy, to Guyana in anno 1633 or 1632. And by Guyana he means the place in South America. He's talking about this guy, Thomas Stump, who was the son of the rector of Yatton Kennel, William Stump, and his wife Elizabeth, née Ivy, who was from Lavington. And this is the adventurous kid who went off to South America in the 1630s. And the Ivies are a very big, very important family. Thomas Stump was taken off on this completely crazy trip to South America by his uncle, Thomas Ivy, who was the brother of Elizabeth Ivy. And anyway, they went off to South America, and it all went horribly wrong. When the ship put in there, 4 or 5 of them straggled into the country too far, and in the interim, the wind served and the sails were hoisted, the stragglers left behind. He was left behind, okay, on the coast of South America. It was not long before the wild people seized on them and stripped them, and those that had beards, they knocked their brains out, and as you remember, did eat them. But the Queen saved T. Stump and the other boy. So his life was saved by a queen of an indigenous tribe, says Aubrey. Stump threw himself into the river Orinoco, the river Orinoco. It's not happening in the Amazon, it's happening in the river Orinoco. In order to drown himself, but he could not sink, he was very full-chested. The other youth shortly died. He lived with them till 1636 or 1637. Right? He lived with the indigenous people on the banks of the river Orinoco for 4 or 5 years. This kid from Yatton Kennel. He says there is an incomparable fruit there, and it may be termed the paradise of the world. And Aubrey's obviously been talking to him. Okay, this is based on a conversation he's had. So guess what? He managed to get home. I never heard of any man that lived so long amongst these savages. A ship then sailing by, this is after 4 or 5 years, a Portuguese ship came by, he swam to it, they took him up, made use of him for a sea boy, and as he was sailing near Cornwall, he stole out of a porthole, swam to shore, and so begged to his fathers in Wiltshire. His fathers in Wiltshire being here, because his father was the rector of Yatton Kennel. When he came home, nobody knew him, and they would not own him. Only John Harris, the carpenter, knew him. And I tried to find John Harris in the records. I can't find John Harris, but a carpenter in Yatton Kennel said, yes, this is the kid. So says Aubrey. So, amazing story. But is it true? And how can this possibly be true? Can this amazing story be true? So I've looked into it a little bit, and it is true. It is true. And I've been able to find out the context for it. And in the records office in Chippenham, I found this document from 1631, which is a legal document instructing two men called Roger Fry and John Day. You can maybe just see their names on the third or fourth line down, John Day and Roger Fry. And they were being instructed by the Earl of Berkshire, one of the aristocrats who lived at Charlton Park, Malmesbury, where the Womack is, to organise a trip to the Amazon in order to establish an English colony on the banks of the Amazon. And it was organised locally at Charlton Park, and clearly local people, including Thomas Ivy and the kid, Thomas Stump, joined in. And this dates from 1631, and the intention was to establish a settlement. Can you see about 4 or 5 lines down? It says, upon the river of the Amazonas. And this is the context for this completely insane trip that he went on. And the idea was to go down to the Amazon, near where there is today a city called Macapa, and establish an English settlement there. And in 1631, a preliminary expedition had gone off and tried to set up a fort there. And when Ivy and the lad Stump went there, that was the plan, that they were going to go there. But the boy didn't reach the place because he had his accident further up in what is now modern Venezuela on the banks of the Orinoco. I mean, it's just a breathtaking story, I think, and it's true. And he made it back, and I found his will. This is his will. 1698, in the name of God, amen. And it's a bit grainy, but it says on the side there, Thomas Stump. And he's buried in Malmesbury Abbey, and he lived as an older man in Abbey House in Malmesbury. And in the Abbey is his memorial. Near this place lies the body of Thomas Stump, gentleman who departed this life the 6th day of April, Anno Domini 1698. Aetatis sue, his age, his years, 79. He was 79. Which means that he was born in about 1619, which means that Aubrey was wrong. He wasn't 16, he was about 13. How could you do this, William Stump and Elizabeth Stump? How could you let your 13-year-old child go off with this crazy uncle on this crazy journey? But it happened. And we only know about the fact that it happened because of the curiosity, this wonderful curiosity about strange tales that John Aubrey has. So, there's a young Cal story. Okay, so that's all the positive stuff. And now, let me dig the dirt. And I didn't go looking for this, I just found this by sort of following the sources. The superstition and misogynism of John Aubrey. Okay, so he was extremely superstitious. And he was writing hundreds of books about all sorts of topics. And he only got around to publishing one of the books in his lifetime. Everything else was published subsequently, and some stuff has never been published. And the only book he managed to publish was called Miscellanies, and it's a book about magic. And fair enough, it's not that surprising that he believed in magic, because almost everybody else believed in magic at the time. One exception being Thomas Hobbes. But he was a believer, and he documented in his book convincing instances of magic. Now, a lot of these are pretty harmless. So here is one, for example, and he proposes this in all seriousness. He says, to cure an ague, like a fever, well, here's what you might do. Write this following spell on a piece of parchment and wear it round your neck. And guess what it says? Literally, abracadabra, abracadabra. And he says, there's a doctor in the city of Wells who uses this, and it works. He says that in the book. He recounts various traditions, and this one, for example, if you're a young woman and you want to know who you're going to marry, this is what you should do. Well, at the first appearance of the new moon after New Year's Day, go out in the evening and look up to the moon and say, all hail to the moon, all hail to thee, I prithee, good moon, reveal to me this night who my husband must be. Then you must go to bed, and in your dreams you'll see your husband. And he says, in all seriousness, I knew gentlewomen that did thus when they were young maids, and they had dreams of those that married them. So It's true. It's true. So Aubrey says this kind of thing. Now, they're charming, but some of the supernatural stuff is the opposite charming. It's about black magic and it's about witchcraft. And he was a believer. He believed in the authenticity of witchcraft. And he believed that this area was a hotbed of witches. And he said that in the natural history of Wiltshire. The Malmesbury Hundred, by which he meant the district around London, had been reputed witches. He also believed that he was personally susceptible to witchcraft. And in 1666, in his autobiographical notes, he said, everything went wrong this year. All my business affairs went round Kim Cam. Nothing took effect, as if I had been under an evil tongue. And that was a euphemism for being bewitched. To be under an evil tongue meant that you had been enchanted, you had been bewitched. And as a result, treacheries and enmities in abundance ran against me. So, now he wasn't alone in these beliefs, and he had a big buddy just down the road at Draycott-Cerne, which is a tiny hamlet near Sutton Bencher, today near the Household Recycling Centre. Anyway, there he is, James Long, and Long was one of his best friends, and he was also passionately convinced about the reality of witchcraft. And the two of them tried to make sense of witchcraft scientifically, because they thought they were terribly modern. And Aubrey, for example, said, you can explain the evil eye, you can explain it scientifically. There's something going on here to do with toxic particles being projected by the witch and infecting the body of the victim. The glances of envy and malice do shoot also subtly. The eye of the malicious person does really infect and make sick the spirit of the other. So they're trying to take scientific ideas as they conceive them and apply them to explaining how we can make sense of witchcraft. And there's a group of them. And there's another guy who's not too far from here in Bath, Joseph Glanville, the rector of Bath Abbey, who writes extensively on this particular topic of science and witchcraft. And as I said maybe at the beginning of the piece, Robert Boyle is another one. The great chemist Robert Boyle is also one of these guys. So Aubrey, Long, Glanville, they're all members of the Royal Society. So the Royal Society set up after the Restoration with a commitment to promoting modern experimental science, but several members of the Royal Society were also committed to justifying witchcraft in scientific terms. And people took them seriously, including this man, Increase Mather, who was the leading light in New England Society, with his son Cotton Mather. And they read this stuff, and they were corresponding with members of the Royal Society. And one of the big themes in my book is the way in which these ideas went over to America and were accepted by these leading lights in Massachusetts in particular. That, in part, was the context for the Salem witch hysteria of 1692. So it's an aspect of that story that's not been properly told before. So I thought that was quite significant. Okay, anyway, our friend, obviously James Long, gets involved in a local case of witchcraft. And it's actually, this is where the whole story started for me. Because I was vaguely aware that people said, wasn't there some witch trial for Malmesbury women? So I went off to research that, and that everything sort of snowballed from that. And there was a trial in 1672 of women from Malmesbury for witchcraft. And Long, who was a local magistrate, was one of the first people on the scene, and he interrogated the suspects. And then, just over 10 years later, he decided to write a book about it, a book about the Malmesbury witches. And the intention, the purpose of the book, was to show how modern science could make sense of the authenticity of sorcery. And he took it for granted that Aubrey agreed with him and would be happily associated with the book. And in the Natural History of Wiltshire, Aubrey mentions this. Now he's writing this in the mid-1680s, and he's in London by then, and he can't quite remember. So he says about 1670 something. He can't remember the exact. there was a cabal of witches detected at Malmesbury. And by cabal, he means a coven. They didn't use the word coven much in the 17th century. And he's not saying, you know, suspected, alleged. They were witches, thinks Aubrey. They were examined, interrogated, by Sir James Long of Draycott's son, and by him committed to Salisbury Jail. I think there were 7 or 8 old women hanged, he says, in his natural history. And there were odd things sworn against them, as of flying in the air on a staff. Excuse me. You're saying they were accused of flying on something a bit like a broomstick? Yep, that's what he's saying. These examinations, the interrogations, Sir James hath fairly written in a book which he promised to give to the Royal Society. So my mate James has written a book, he's going to write a book, and he's going to give it to the Royal Society because it's scientific and they're scientific, so they'll want to know about it. And a couple of letters from Long to Aubrey talking about this project have survived in the Bodleian. And in this letter, he talks about how I started to write it, and I've written the introductory letter, and I'm going to dedicate it to the President of the Royal Society. And he's about 5 or 6 lines down, he talks about how our President and Fellowship, these are the members of the Royal Society, it's going to be a gift to them. And in the letter, he says, would you, Aubrey, would you mind actually taking the book to London and giving it to them? And we haven't got Aubrey's reply, but it's obvious that Aubrey has no problem with this at all, that they're on the same page in terms of this particular project. Long goes on to say, in the book, I'm going to show how this coven has been operating for 100 years and systematically seeking to harm the good people of the town. I'm going to set forth, I'm going to tell the story of all the revenges, all the bad things that the coven has been guilty of. Okay, now Aubrey had no problem with any of this, and clearly thought that the persecution of these women was legitimate. There was one slight problem, though. He couldn't remember how many of them had been hanged. Because do you remember he said, oh, I think 6 or 7 of them were hanged. Well, that's an extraordinary number. 6 or 7 people were hanged. Anyway, I've looked into the case, and Aubrey, as is often the case, was wrong. Women were hanged, but only 2 women were hanged. And we have court records that make this absolutely clear. And they were called Judith Witchell and Anne Tilling, and they were executed in Salisbury in 1672. So what does it all mean? Well, I'm struck by Aubrey's forgetfulness. How could you forget that there were 2 women killed rather than 6 or 7 women killed? Unless actually the fate of these marginalised poor women didn't really interest you or bother you a great deal. I mean, that's the only conclusion. Because it's such an extraordinary thing, isn't it? That he was associated with this particular event. And it led to these executions. But he couldn't remember. Was it 2? Was it 6? Was it 7? You know. I don't think it comes very well out of that particular story. Okay, changing gear quite violently. His personal life. Now, I could, there's a lot we can say about his personal life. He never marries. I think he has various girlfriends during his life. But he gets involved in one particular courtship that goes disastrously wrong. And this is very famous, the courtship of a woman called Joan Sumner, who came from the village of Seend, and it's reshaped, it's mostly Georgian, but this beautiful, beautiful house in Seend was her family home. And she was an heiress to a wealthy clothier family, and they had property in Kingston St Michael, they had property in Sutton Benja, and they were wealthy. She was an eligible heiress. Anyway, Aubrey by the 1660s is in severe financial distress. He inherits his father's estate in 1652. He also inherits all his father's very substantial debts, and he inherits all his father's legal disputes. And his father's been battling in the courts for years over a will, disputing the terms of a will that was made in 1595 to do with large amounts of property in Wales. And the Aubreys thought that they'd been cheated and that this land was theirs by rights. And they were still disputing it, 50 or 60 years later, and spending a fortune on lawyers' costs, to challenge this land transfer of many, many years before. Now, Aubrey inherits the case, and he perseveres in trying to win this case. So he spends thousands of pounds failing to win his case. He loses the case. So he inherits a bunch of debt. He makes his situation much worse by pursuing this doomed legal case, and he's pretty profligate. So this is a pretty toxic mix in terms of Aubrey's finances. And by the mid-1660s, he's in serious financial trouble. And you remember he said in 1666, everything had gone wrong, and his explanation was, oh, I must have been bewitched. Well, I think there are maybe some other possible explanations. And anyway, so he's in trouble. What's the solution? Maybe I can find a rich heiress, is a thought that crosses his mind. And he sets out to court Joan Sumner. Now, this distinguished gent is Anthony Powell, the famous novelist, who is also, he's passed away now, who was a biographer of Aubrey. And he wrote a very distinguished biography. It's a very good biography of Aubrey. But like lots of people, he demonizes Joan Sumner. She's the baddie in the story. And he says this: Aubrey got into a mess with a dangerous woman. He says that. Joan Sumner is a dangerous woman. Now, I've looked into this and looked at some of the court records in the National Archive, and I have a completely opposite 180-degree view of what happened. And I think Joan Sumner got into a mess with a dangerous man, our friend. And the story is this, that in 1665, Aubrey proposes, and of course, because they're elite posh people, there's a lot of dealing that goes on then about the finances and the money. And there was a deal, there was a contract established between them. And under the terms of the contract, she was going to bring him £2,000, right? £2,000 dowry, huge amount of money, be able to pay off his debts. In return, she was offered a so-called jointure, a widow's portion, in the event that he predeceased her. And that was based on Eastern Piercy and the nearby farm and farmland. And that would have given her, if he died before her, a widow's pension and a very nice house. So that was the deal. What Aubrey didn't tell Joan was that he didn't really own the house. Because as a result of his debts, he mortgaged it to a guy called Croom from Castle Coombe. And he owned it because he had the mortgage. So it was an act of fraud, actually, to say to this woman, live with me, everything will be fine, and if I die before you, don't worry. It wasn't true, because the house and almost everything he owned was in Hull. So there was the secret of the mortgage. And it came to light. She found out about the mortgage. Well, how do you expect someone to respond to that? She was incensed when she found out what he was attempting to do. So she broke off the marriage. And she broke off the marriage. And he then took her to court for breach of price. He held on to a lot of her papers that he had as a result of the betrothal. He seems to have sanctioned his mate James Long to have harassed her with regard to property in Sutton Venture, and gone into some of her property and chopped down timber and blah, 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 blah. I think he behaved in a really disgraceful way. And he took her to court. And there was a whole series of acrimonious court cases that he lost. But he started the court cases that he lost. that he was punished for and that he incurred these costs for. And this is not the story you get in Ruth Skur, in Anthony Powell. They demonize Joan Sumner. But what she said to the course of Chancery in one of these court cases was, this defendant, me, Joan, had a real intent to marry the said complainant, if the jointure which the said complainant made unto this defendant had been clear and free of encumbrances, which it was not. I would have married him. I didn't know it was all mortgaged. And by the way, she's the defendant. In other words, he has taken her to court, right, as a result of something bad that he has done to her. And it collapsed. And he was in debt anyway, and everything was mortgaged. And then he had to pay all these costs. And it all collapsed. So he had to sell up. And he had to sell Easton Piercy. And that's when, and it is poignant, that's when he did this picture. He did it when he was just about to leave. He's selling up, and it was a memento of this house that he really, really loved. But there we go. So he has this terrible crisis in his life, and from that point on, he's basically homeless and staying with friends. And one of the friends he stays with in the early 1670s is this guy, Henry Coley, who was a leading astrologer and magician in London. And I've looked into this chap, and I'm certain that he practiced illegal spirit magic. For people who have problems in their love lives, etc., you could go to him and he would offer a magical solution, not just to love problems, but that was the main business. Okay, so in this period, and he's always been superstitious. He comes under the influence of this guy, Henry Coley. And one of the things that I explore in the book is the possibility that perhaps influenced by Coley and others, he actually indulges personally in a form of black magic in around this period. And you can't be exactly sure what's going on here, but what I came across was an unpublished manuscript in the Bodley, and it's catalogued as Aubrey manuscript 24, which in the catalogue is described as a work of astrology. But it isn't. It's a work of black magic. And it dates from 1674. It very precisely dates at 1674, when we know that Aubrey was under the influence of Coley and was spending a lot of his time actually living with Coley in Holborn in London. And there's two parts to it. The first part is a Latin document headed Zecabeni, and nobody really knows what Zecabeni means. But we do know what the thing is, and it's a black magic manual. And then at the end of the manuscript, there's a collection of much shorter spells. So the whole thing altogether is a guide to doing black magic, to doing witchcraft. And here it is. So it's this little book, and I should have thought to clean my nails before I took this photograph. That's me holding it open in the Bodleian. And you know what? On the left-hand side there, you know what they are? They're wands. They are wands, because this first part of the thing, Zecabeni, is a guide for wizards as to how you can do magic. And it's ritual magic, and you've got to do all sorts of things, and you need to use a ritual sword or wand, and he draws them all and explains them. It's somewhat Harry Potter, but it's, say, more Voldemort than it is Harry, in terms of the darkness of the magic that is being proposed. So, it's a manual for people interested in summoning, controlling, and deploying demons for magical purposes. And it gives you instructions as to how you can harm other people, and how you can induce people to be compliant in love against their wishes. The intended reader was, I've said here, a trainee wizard. It's a guide, so you want to be a wizard, you want to do some black magic? It's a user manual for someone who wants to do black magic. Somebody interested in learning the techniques involved in the difficult business of summoning and controlling evil spirits. The sort of the theology of it is a little bit confused because the spells involve the wizard attempting to force these demons, who are clearly evil spirits, to come and obey his will. And you might say, oh, it's not really witchcraft then, is it? Because you're not in a pact with the devil, you're using some other force to compel the demons. And some people would have said that, but it's nonsense. It's manifestly a version of witchcraft, because the idea is that you harness the power of demons in order to do immoral acts, harming other people, forcing people who are not interested in you to take an interest in you. It's evil. It's using demons for dark purposes. It's a very dark thing. It contains lots of these amazing diagrams, which are called pentacles, and they're all like specialist ones that you should use depending on what it is you're trying to do. So lots of pentacles for different purposes, because you want to summon specialist demons for particular activities. So Aubrey has very meticulously copied out all of these charts. So this is his writing. That's his handwriting at the bottom there. It says hoc pentaculum. It's all in Latin. The text tells you that you want to do this particular spell. You've got to use this particular talisman. You've got to create like a magic circle, and you need various smells and perfumes and incense, and you've got your magic sword or your wand, and you summon the demon. It gives you the words, the incantation that you should use. You need to be wearing the pentacles, and you should copy them out, of course, on not previously used parchment, virgin parchment, in bat's blood, as you do. I don't know where they got the bat's blood from. And the pentacles have this power to force demons to obey the wizard, and there were these specialists. So there's a group of demons, and he lists them, all these strange names, for example, who were identified as the specialist ministers of love and fornication. That's what it says in Latin. There's pentacles of Mars if you want to hurt somebody. There's pentacles of Venus if you want to improve your love life. And the pentacles of Venus have the power to force a desired woman to look favourably upon you.